Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and my guest today is author, journalist, film producer, and podcaster Robert Bryce. Robert is the host of the Power Hungry podcast, and his credits include the documentary Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, as well as books such as Cronies, Pipe Dreams, Gusher of Lies, and his most recent book, which we are discussing today, A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. Robert, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be with you, Chris.
So I've listened to a few episodes of Power Hungry, and I'm going to take a page out of your book. And I know over on your show, you have the guests introduce themselves. So besides what I just mentioned, you want to say a little bit about your background, who you are, and what your interests are?
Happy to do that. That's my trope, I guess. I've heard a lot of windy introductions, so I just thought, well, I don't want to do that. Here's your basic thing, but thank you, Chris. I'm Robert Bryce. First things first, I'm a proud dad and a proud husband. My wife, Lauren, and I have been together for 40 years, married for 36 and a half. We have three great kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob. They're all above average. They're all musicians and darling, and they're healthy, and they're out of the house. So those are all really, the empty nest is a beautiful thing. I'm also an author, journalist. I focus on energy and power systems and consider myself incredibly lucky. I've been very fortunate in my career. I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole life. I care about these issues. I'm passionate about them. So how about that? Now let's stop there and get on to talk about what's going on, because there is a boatload, a shitload. Like we can talk about. We can say
you can swear. Yeah, that's perfect. So you want to say just how did you get interested in energy in the first place?
Sure.
Energy and electricity. How did that come to be your specialty?
Sure. Well, Tulsa's my hometown, and it's an energy town. For about 20 minutes, it was called the oil capital of the world. That title is clearly now Houston, Texas. But my dad was in the insurance business, but he knew a lot of people in the energy business. So from a young age, I was exposed to it. I knew what it was about, and I saw it in the. I hunted when I was a kid, and I'd hunt in the oil field, and I knew what it looked like, and so. I started in journalism and writing for the Austin Chronicle. I started doing some articles on energy and power and realized, well, this is the world's biggest and most important industry. And so that just continued. And so I've been writing about energy and power systems now for more than 30 years.
We can talk about more than the book that I mentioned, A Question of Power.
Good.
But the topic of this book is also the topic of the documentary Juice. They're companion pieces, correct?
That's right. And what I should have in my introduction, I should have said my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. We're going to sell self-promotion is part of the podcast landscape. So if I'm going to have people listen to anything, go to my Substack. I have a new Substack, in fact, out today called the Anti-Industry, which is exposing the reality that the anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear NGOs are outspending the traditional energy sector, that would be the oil and gas and nuclear sectors, coal sector, by more than 4 to 1. And so this
in terms of lobbying and advocacy, these claims, which are just false, that are repeated over and over in the New York Times, NPR, the New Yorker. That the renewable industry is backfooted because the Koch brothers or ExxonMobil or, the usual bad bogeymen are somehow preventing progress. It's just wrong. It's not true. It's never been true. And so I put the numbers together. $4.5 billion a year is being spent by the anti-hydrocarbon, what I call the anti-industry, or the climate aristocracy, Chris Kiefer calls them, to promote these, what is really a pretty radical agenda of shutting down the hydrocarbon sector, electrifying everything, trying to force the economy to run solely on renewables. It's a fool's errand and a dangerous one. But I wanted to, get that off my chest because it's something I've been working on very hard for the last few weeks. But as far as the electricity sector, this is one of my main focuses of my work now. And yes, thank you. The book that I wrote, A Question of Power, which I keep at hand. Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. It's been out 3 years. The paperback version is coming out in May. I've been just was working on the new preface for that. But yes, it came out in 2020, and in the preceding 2 to 3 years, I worked on a documentary called "Juice: How Electricity Explains the World," and I wrote the book at the same time. I don't recommend it. It was a very difficult thing to do, but now that they're both done, I can say, yeah, I did it, and so I'm proud of both of them, and both of them are. Efforts to look at the world through the lens of electricity, which is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy.
What are the most important things accomplished by electricity that a modern person, a modern Westerner takes for granted in their everyday life?
Yeah, I like that question, Chris. I would say it's the importance of electricity to women and girls. My mother was born in 1925. My grandmother was born in 1894, if memory serves. The era of electricity is not that old. So when my grandmother was born in what was then Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s, electricity was unknown. And there were parts of Oklahoma that weren't electrified until the 1940s, after the Rural Electrification Administration and the New Deal reforms of the 1930s took effect. So this phenomenon of rural electrification in America is relatively new. This is not something that's been here forever. And in modern America forget, because electricity is ubiquitous, and we complain when we have outages and the rest of it. But around the world, there are more than 3 billion people who live in places where electricity consumption is less than what's used by an average kitchen refrigerator here in the United States, right? 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. There are more than 70 countries where that amount of electricity that's greater than the per capita average in those countries. So, but who benefits the most from electrification? Well, we all do, but women and girls in particular. As I like to say it, Chris, electricity frees women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. And this was one of the things that the architects of the New Deal and rural electrification, George Norris, Burton Wheeler, Senator George Norris from Nebraska, Burton Wheeler from Montana, Representative Sam Rayburn before he became Speaker of the House. They knew this, and they knew how important electricity was to rural women. And so that was one of the motivating factors for them in getting that legislation passed in 1935 and 1936 that electrified rural America. So I've given you a long answer, but what we forget and take for granted is if we are serious about reducing rural poverty and bringing women and girls in developing countries into modernity, we need to give them power. Well, they need the juice. We need to provide more. And I say we, the people, they need more electricity because that's the key.
What do you think are the primary roadblocks to people today who are not electrified or who are energy poor, electricity poor, living on less than the electricity that powers your refrigerator?
Well, this is a complex question, Chris, and it's one that goes to the basic civil society. Theft is the enemy of light. Corrupt countries, they don't have electricity because corruption is rampant. And so you can't create an electric grid if theft is an accepted part of the culture. There has to be I call it the esprit de grid. There has to be some sensibility about the electricity as a common good, and people have to pay for it. You can't just give it away. And if you do, it won't work for very long because it's simply, you can't make the system work if everybody is stealing and nobody's paying. So there are a number of interconnected things. You need capital, you need fuel, and you need this integrity. And the integrity is the first one. You need the societal integrity, capital, and fuel. Those are the three prerequisites to effective electrification. And electrification worked here in the U.S. because we had societal integrity and we had fuel, particularly coal in the early days. Now we're running a lot of gas and we're still using a lot of coal. But if you have capital, then you have to keep that capital in the grid. The grid, yes, we put fuel in it, but really electricity systems run on money.
You go over it in the book, but in the documentary, it's very stark because you see it. You go through and you walk through villages, poor villages, where there are these large hooks that, it's like a big metal hook on a rod that people hang off of or hook into the power lines and siphon off electricity. And it's not like analogous to piracy or something like that, where we say what you want about it. You're actually just making a copy. You're not actually taking anything physically from the system. You really are taking away the electricity, and which requires fuel and all kinds of things to produce. So it's a different kind of thing. It's electronic theft, but it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good way to think about it. They're free riding, right? And so, and this is one of the things that very clearly you could see in Iraq. And so I'll state the obvious: Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. I mean, a really bad guy, but he kept the lights on, right? You could look at Iraq prior to Saddam and after Saddam. And he, once he came into power, he bolstered the electric grid. The electrification of Iraq worked pretty well under Saddam Hussein. Once Saddam was taken out and executed by the Americans and by the Saudarites in Iraq, the whole electric grid in Iraq disintegrated, and it's still in terrible shape today because there's no one enforcing the law, right? You didn't steal under Saddam because if you got discovered, bad things had happened, right? So that's a clear example of how societal integrity, whether it's done by a despot or by democratic systems and cops and the rest of it, ultimately the grid doesn't care, right? But the grid, it needs that integrity to function well. So I think that's just an important distinction to make, that despotic regimes, anti-democratic regimes, Saudi Arabia, the lights stay on, right? They're not, this is a kingdom, right? But they make sure the grid works because that's part of their social contract, right? So I just think it's important to understand that understanding is clear, right? That grids are fragile things and they require this integrity of the entire system for them to work.
So you're emphasizing two major roadblocks to electrification that are primarily social or legal or political. You're talking about widespread theft from the grid, but also widespread corruption from maybe the people running the grid. And just notably, neither of these are technical roadblocks. Neither of these are technological roadblocks. These are more about rule of law.
They're societal, and they are sometimes driven by extreme poverty, right? That in India, where you talked about, where we saw the hooking, right, where there were hooks and people were stealing electricity. I mean, the one thing I've only been to India once, so I'm hardly an expert, but I've been asked, well, what surprised you in making the documentary and when doing the book? And my answer is the level of poverty. I didn't understand what it was. I thought I understood poverty, and I'd seen poverty here in the United States, but the grinding poverty that I saw in India exceeded anything that I was familiar with. And so if I was living in that situation, would I hook the line and steal power too? Damn right I would.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are amazingly high. It's I think an experience like that, which I haven't had, but I mean, you can have it through reading, through watching documentaries, of realizing that as an average person in a Western country, you're phenomenally wealthy.
Yeah.
Relative to most people in history and most people in the world today. Or maybe not. Yeah, definitely most people in the world today. So these are the big roadblocks. So what would you say about you talk a lot in the book about the electrification of rural America. Now, this was done to some extent legislatively and directed by the New Deal, not exclusively, I think. What do you think was the roadblock for the United States prior to those legislative efforts? I mean, is this something that would have happened anyway, just a little bit later or in a little bit more of a patchy kind of way? Or was this necessary to be done in a kind of a top-down way through the New Deal?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is it was complicated, right? Grids are complex. And what FDR in 1932, in one of the few presidential speeches that's ever been given about electricity, and he was in Portland, Oregon in 1931, I think late 31, or maybe it was in 32. And he gave a speech that was largely focused on electricity and electrification. And it was about busting the trusts at that time. There were the big electric holding companies, and the holding companies controlled vast territories. And one of them was controlled by Samuel Insull, who's been vilified wrongly in many cases, I think. But nevertheless, if you think about the electric grid, if you own a grid and you're Insull, well, if you live in Chicago, well, sure, let's electrify Chicago. You get lots of people living in one building or a building right next door. Well, it only takes me a fairly small amount of wire and poles and transformers and distribution stuff to electrify those two buildings. And there's more buildings right across the street and the rest of it. But when you get out to Alpine, Texas, or Crawford, Texas, or, No Trees or Goldsmith, way out in the boondocks, Well, you've got to run one line that would go for miles and only serve four, five, six customers. So the holding companies, the big holding companies at that time, they weren't going to do that because there was no incentive. They would lose money on those customers. So this was something where there was, I don't know if you would call it a market failure. I'm not an economist, but whether they would call it a market failure, but it was, the market wasn't going to provide that. The regular and conventional capitalist market for around grids, and which are natural monopolies, they weren't going to go out and do that. They weren't going to go out and string that wire to those customers in Goldthwaite or, wherever, some small little town out in the boondocks. And so this was what the government then stepped in with the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, which busted up the trusts, the big holding companies, and the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. Those two things together then broke up these monopolies over these systems, and they also provided capital to rural areas where cooperatives could form and say, well, we'll borrow money from the government and then and string the wire or build the power stations or whatever it took to provide that electrification. But I'll just one quick point that I think is really important there to think about. Several people have written about this. In Path to Power, Robert Caro writes about it. When Lyndon Johnson, who's one of my political heroes, right, he was a deeply flawed man, but the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65 were his great redemption. Vietnam was his great sin, but the others were things that I think are critically important in American history. But he was also a great advocate for rural electrification. Now, he didn't get to Washington until 1937, and after these bills were passed. But nevertheless, he was a staunch advocate for this. But when he was in the 30s, when Johnson City, right where he was born, there weren't enough people in the Texas Hill Country to get together to form a cooperative. It's hard to believe today, given how many people live in and around Austin, but at that time it was very sparsely populated. So these cooperatives had to come together, and you had to have these political entities form and then go to the government to say, we want to borrow money. And in fact, LBJ went to FDR. There's a famous story about this, and I think it was in 1938. He went to FDR and asked a personal favor. Hey, would you guarantee the loan to Pedernales Electric Cooperative? Because, and they hadn't qualified. They didn't have enough people. And FDR did him a personal favor. They extended the loan to Pedernales, and now today it's the largest electric cooperative in America, 300,000 meters.
Can we jump gears a little bit? And
sure.
Can you say something about what you call the terawatt challenge? What is the terawatt challenge?
Well, let's start with what a terawatt is. So kilo, mega, gigatera, peta, exa. What are the other ones? Yocto, Yoda. No, it's not Yocto, Yoda.
That's higher than anyone knows.
1,000 million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion. A terawatt is 1,000 gigawatts. It's 1 million megawatts. It's 1 billion kilowatts. So we have in the United States about 1 terawatt, roughly. It's a little more than that. 1 terawatt of generation capacity. All right, that's for all of the solar, all the wind, all the nuclear plants in America, about 1 terawatt. We need, globally, it's about 6 terawatts, something like that. Might be a little more than that now. But there are all these people who are living in dire energy poverty today, and electricity demand is growing globally. It's the fastest growing form of energy globally, and has been for decades. We're adding roughly one new Brazil of new demand every year, around 500 or 600 terawatt hours. Well, we have to keep expanding the global grid. And how are we going to do that? How are we going to bring power to the powerless? And what I've been saying now for more than 13 years is natural gas to nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonizing, if we're serious about bringing more people out of the dark, what are the ways forward? Renewables can't do it. I've been a long-time critic of the renewable industry, proudly so. I think that it's a subsidy-driven business that cannot survive on its own, despite all the things they claim. If we're serious about reducing energy poverty, providing more power, we need sources of electricity that can be generated on small footprints with low material inputs that are low or no carbon. That's natural gas and nuclear. So the terawatt challenge, to get back to your question, Chris, is how do we get that? How do we expand the grid? How do we double our electric output? Because has been doubling every 20 years. How are we going to achieve that now? And I think if we're serious about it, we've got to be serious about nuclear energy.
So electricity has to be powered by something. It's powered by fuel, and you've laid out your preference for natural gas and nuclear. You call that end to end. What is power density, and why is that concept so important and underknown, and how does it play into the problems with renewables, with primarily solar and wind?
You're asking hitting all my favorite topics here, Chris. Boy, I like that. Power density is it's one of the most important metrics in physics, in power and energy systems, and very few people understand it. And I didn't understand it. And it's taken me a long while. And frankly, I had to teach myself what it meant. And I give due credit to Václav Smil and Jesse Ausubel, two energy thinkers who I quite admire. And they're helping me or really teaching me how to understand it through their books and their writing. What is power density? Power density, well, first, what's the difference between energy and power? Energy is the ability to do work. Power is the rate at which work gets done. We don't care what energy is. We care about what energy does, and energy gives us power. So I could put my typical example. I have an '06 Toyota Tundra pickup truck. I could put peanut butter, popcorn, or marshmallows or oatmeal in the tank if I thought when I pressed the accelerator it would give me the power that I wanted. Right? I don't really care what I put in the tank. I always put gasoline in there because that's what it's designed for. But I don't really care what the form of energy is as long as it gives me that motive power. I don't really care. This light is right here. I don't really care what form of energy is being used to produce the watts that are driving this light. I only care that I have the light. Same with this magnification or the amplification on this microphone. We want power. We don't give a shit about energy. So energy is the ability to do work, right? But we have to make energy flow to produce power, and that's the difference. What energy is denominated in joules, power is denominated in watts. 1 joule per second equals 1 watt. Power is a function of time. 1 joule over a certain amount of time gives you power. So we want power. What we are after is power. So I'm coming back now to this electricity, right? I could waving my hand here in front of this light. So if it's from a wind turbine, well, that's fine. If it's from a solar plant, well, that's fine too. But the power density, the amount of land that's needed for a nuclear power plant is 1,000 times less than what's required by the wind turbine.
To make the same amount of power.
That is the power density. So back to power density. It's a measure of energy flow that can be harnessed in a given area, volume, or mass. And we care particularly about area. We don't want to carpet the entire world with wind turbines and solar panels. I don't. I'm adamantly opposed to that. It's terrible. That's anti-environmentalism. And yet that's what we're being sold. Well, that's a bad idea because the lower the power density, when you're starting with corn ethanol or wind, two of the lowest forms of power production, you have to counteract that with high material inputs. That means you need a lot of fertilizer, copper, concrete, land, steel, all of these things to counteract low power density. So low power density is the enemy of the environment. We want high power density because that means we need less land. That's one of the many reasons why I'm so pro-nuclear. So power density, in my 4th book, Power Hungry, I lay out the 4 imperatives, and power density is the first one. Power density, energy density, cost, and scale. And power density is first because it is the most important metric.
This is basically, how much power we can get out of some unit of input, and whatever that is.
Not some unit of input. The inputs will vary depending on the power density. So power density is a measure of energy flow from a given area, volume, or mass. So a volume would be an engine, right? One of the Model T engines, you can only get like 20 horsepower out of this, this thing, right? But today, a Ford engine or, a modern engine, you get 200 horsepower out of the same volume. Or you could also do it by mass, right? Which would be a similar kind of calculation on that engine, right? But we really care about land use. So that power density and measure of energy flow per unit of area, that's the one we really care about because that then determines those other inputs. Did I make that clear?
Yeah. The only thing now I'm a little confused about is what's the difference between power density and energy density, or are they synonyms? They're not synonyms. You said they're different concepts.
So power and energy and power are not the same thing. Commonly confused, and I don't want to sound pedantic here, but these things matter. I mean, they are incredibly important. Okay, so power density is a measure of energy flow from a given area, volume, or mass. That's kind of abstract. Well, here I can hold up this bottle of water, and I know many of you you're not watching this, you're listening, but I've got a bottle of water in my hand. Now, the easiest way to understand energy density is, okay, well, let me pour the water out, and I'll fill it with sawdust. I've been trimming my trees here. I could gather all the little sawdust from all the trees that I've trimmed, and I could put it in this bottle. And the energy density of the bottle would be higher, obviously, than if it were empty. but it would be nothing compared to if I pour all that sawdust out and fill it with gasoline or diesel fuel. Ooh, suddenly the energy density is far higher. So that is the amount of energy density is the number of joules, the amount of energy that's contained in a given, in this case, a volume or a mass, right? I could weigh this, right? So if the weight of a pound of sawdust would still have less energy density than a pound of gasoline. And a liter of sawdust would have less energy than a liter of gasoline. So energy density matters, particularly in cars, right? Because we don't want it, that's one of the reasons why electric cars are problematic, because you got to carry around these very low energy density batteries, and they still weigh the same whether they're full or discharged, right? Whereas with gasoline, you burn the gasoline, and the tank, when it's empty, it weighs less than when you started. So energy density matters a lot. But power density is the one that matters. I always put it first, and they're interrelated, but they're not the same thing.
And nuclear energy is far and away the densest form of energy that we have access to currently.
The most power dense by multiple measures, right? By many multiples.
So what are the popular concerns with nuclear energy? Why is it demonized? Why is it not bigger than it is? Why has it stalled so much in the last 50 years?
How much time do we have, Chris?
I mean, this is probably the topic that's most interesting to me. So
yeah,
as much as you want.
Well, it's complicated and simple. I guess part of the reason, one way to think about it this simple is, why has nuclear been demonized so effectively for so many years, is because these very large NGOs like this, I don't call them environmental groups. I don't call them green groups, because I don't think they're environmentalists and I don't think they're green. And I'm a longtime critic of them, proudly so. I think these forces are a sign of decadence in America. And the amount of money they're spending on bad energy policy is just stunning how much it is. But they have been very effective. And the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the worst, absolute worst at this, because they've been demonizing nuclear energy for decades and were part and complicit and leading the charge to close the nuclear plant at Indian Point in New York. In Buchanan, New York. I think they should be criminally prosecuted for what they did. They're so offensive to me, because consumer bills and CO2 emissions rose dramatically after they closed that plant, and shouldn't have never been closed. So I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic here. But what have they done? These groups have effectively demonized nuclear energy, conflated it with nuclear weaponry, and instilled fear of radiation. All these things that are easy to do, right? And the danger, and it's been very destructive. So they are part of the problem. There is no doubt about it, and they are part of it. Some of the blame lies with the nuclear utilities themselves and the nuclear industry. Some of it is just that it's natural that the public, I think, and this is I think a fair point as well, the public has a natural fear of radiation because they can't see it, can't feel it, can't touch it, can't smell it. And they don't understand it. And they don't understand what dosage is and what, we're hit with radiation all the time. When we go out in the sun, when you get warm, well, that we're feeling radiation. So there are a number of factors here, Chris, that are at work, and all of them play a role. I tend to point the finger at these NGOs because I think they bear a whole lot of responsibility for this. And they could, and if they were serious about carbon emissions, would change their tune and turn around and say, no, we realize now we cannot decarbonize. We have no chance of meeting our CO2 emissions reduction targets without nuclear. But they won't do it because they're fundraising machines. They're not serious about the environment. But I would also say, and just to be fair, or rather to be clear, some of the blame here lies with the Democratic Party. And I say this is not a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. But the Democrats have been anti-nuclear for decades. And this is partly due to their affiliations with some of these NGOs. There are many factors together why nuclear energy in America has stalled. Now, I'll just answer a question you haven't asked. Are we seeing a change now? Are we seeing a nuclear renaissance, a nuclear comeback? I think we are. But what I fear is that nuclear is going to have to succeed overseas, probably in Eastern Europe, before it succeeds back here in the United States. That is, we're finishing 2 reactors, Plant Vogtle 3 and 4, the reactors 3 and 4 now. They've been over budget over time, dramatically so. And those reactors are, they're going to be finished soon. But the U.S. in terms of new nuclear is really stuck.
You think it's going to need like a concrete demonstration of success in a place like Eastern Europe, and they
Yeah.
have the political motivation to do it, presumably because they're motivated more than ever to not be reliant on Russian energy. Is that the idea?
That's one of the reasons, and that's clearly one of the catalysts behind this renaissance for nuclear in Eastern Europe. But remember, there's the gas supply issue from Russia, but also there are carbon taxes that are in place, carbon levies in Europe that are stacked on top of the increased price of nat gas.
Oh, I see.
So
More so than in the US.
Those carbon taxes, they call them the carbon fee, or I forgot what the name of it is, the term of art they have for it. I talked with my friend Mark Nelson from the Radiant Energy Group about this earlier, but he spells this out very clearly. And so the climate issues, the greenhouse gas issues in Europe are much more baked into the whole economy than they are in the US. Add in a natural gas price that in Europe today, I don't know, I didn't check TTF today. I think it's 15 or 16, something like that, dollars per million BTUs. That higher price natural gas is the other motivator. So you add those two together, nuclear in Europe is economic at these prices for the Europeans. It's difficult here in the US because nat gas is so cheap. So, but yes, I think that you add the Russia-Ukraine issue is one of them. It is not the only reason why Europe is a more promising place for nuclear, but it is a key one. That shutoff of gas being part of that is clearly a motivator.
What do you think about Alex Epstein's claim that despite the promise of nuclear, it may be decades before it's, really doing what it should be doing because it's been virtually criminalized for decades and doesn't have, 100+ years of industry experience to lean on?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Alex, and he's done a lot of good thinking on this and been very effective in communicating it. Criminalized, I wouldn't use that word. Demonized, yes. Criminalized. I'm with Twain, right? The difference between the right word and the wrong word is quite large. The difference between the lightning and the lightning bug. There are problems that the industry created itself. Mistakes were made in outsourcing supply chain issues, especially for providing, enriched uranium and effectively ceding that to the Russians. We let our manufacturing system decay so that we're not, we don't have that industrial capability. But part of that is also a function of the way the grid in the United States works. We're not France, right? We don't have one electricity company in the United States. We have 3,000. So the French could say, we're going to build nuclear because it was a very centralized system, very centralized grid, very centralized in terms of decision-making, ownership, et cetera. Here in the United States, you have 800 and some odd cooperatives. You have how many public power utilities? Like I live in Austin, it's a publicly owned electric company. You have 180 investor-owned utilities. You have, the government sponsored entities like Tennessee Valley Authority and Bonneville Power. We have a very diffused system of ownership in the grid in the United States. So it's not given that diffused ownership, it's much harder for us. I'm going to say us. These, all of these utilities to come together and say, we're going to bet $20 billion on a new nuclear power plant, right? There's just not that. The decision-making system is much more diffused, and that because of that, the commitment, the willingness to commit to these big projects like Vogtle are more difficult.
One of the reasons that I suspect nuclear is so easily demonized is based on, I think it's called the availability heuristic, this like psychological bias that people have, where if you can readily bring to mind examples of things, you have a tendency to overestimate how common or frequent or important they are. This is the reason, people often might be more worried about terrorism than, say, ordinary crime, because you can easily think of big, scary examples of terrorism.
Right.
Crime is just this pervasive thing, whereas like terrorism deaths are a tiny fraction of regular murder deaths. So that's the bigger, scarier problem. But you can bring to mind a terrorist example in your head. Well, it's the same thing. I think the number of things that have gone wrong, say with coal mining accidents or people who have died, this is just kind of background statistics that no one knows about. But you can bring to mind like the exactly 3 important nuclear disasters that have ever happened. And if you tell people that nuclear is a good idea, they say, well, what about Fukushima? What about 3 Mile Island?
Sure.
Checkmate. I thought about it.
And those events, rare though they are, reinforce that fear cycle, right? And
Yeah.
this is one of the things I point out in my piece and on my Substack piece, robertbryce.substack.com.
Will be linked to in the show notes.
Thank you. In this industry piece that I wrote was that when you compare the battlefield, right, and it is a battlefield of ideas, the anti-hydrocarbon, anti-nuclear NGOs have a natural advantage over the traditional energy providers. And by traditional, I mean hydrocarbons and nuclear, right? In that, what are they doing? They're constantly talking about fear of climate change, fear of fracking, fear of radiation. And they beat the shit out of those issues, right? Oh, well, climate change, got to go to renewables, right? Radiation, fear fracking, right? Oh, they're going to poison your water. Therefore, you can't have hydraulic fracturing. So they have, and we as humans, this is kind of natural. If something is scary, oh, well, we're going to get concerned about that. That old trope. No politician ever got elected by saying things are going to be fine, right? You gotta say, no, that guy, that gal, she is gonna mess it up, and if she gets in, you're gonna be in the street. Everything's gonna be terrible. I'm gonna save you from that, right? And so that fear is a very big part of this challenge in changing the narrative, changing the story around nuclear and getting more momentum for nuclear energy. In Europe, I think they're a little bit ahead because the economic drivers are so strong. And I think most encouraging, perhaps, is what's happening in Japan, because in Japan, they are making a big return to nuclear. And as I've thought about it, I'm working on another documentary. If Japan can go back to nuclear, they can show the rest of the world that it can be done. The rest of the world can do it too.
And they presumably pulled back after Fukushima. And what's the current motivation? Is it related to Russia as well?
It's that the Japanese government has realized we cannot, Japan is a very densely populated country. I've only been there once. I'm going back, in fact, next week. I'm really excited about it. Very densely populated country, and a lot of it's cold, and they don't have a lot of room for more renewables. I think they're just looking around and saying, you know what? We don't have a choice. We have got to restart these reactors. Yeah, Fukushima, okay, yeah, whatever. But they're going to restart their reactors. They're going to run them longer, and they are going to build more reactors. The government has just recently made that clear. So I think this is just practical politics.
And for people who don't know, how many people died in Fukushima?
From radiation, 0.
There were
2 people at the plant who died. They drowned. And this is one of the things that is so important, and that in fact, the fear of radiation around nuclear and the evacuation of Fukushima was more problematic than anything having to do with the radiation.
Yeah, traffic accidents, things like that.
Well, and people being
concerns.
displaced and pulled out of their homes, and then the stress and the frustration and all of the health issues that came with that was more problematic than anything that would have been caused by the radiation. And I think the public health surveys have shown this very clearly.
And newer plants or newer models for plants have significantly lower risks of meltdown, correct?
You're talking about the nuclear plants. That's the objective, to have them be passively safe. That if you walk away safe is the one of the terms that they like to use. One of the problems with Fukushima was that you had to have these water circulation pumps, always, circulating water through the reactor core. And once the tsunami hit, it took out the grid power, but it also took out the standby generators. So once that system of power or water circulation stopped, the reactor overheated and as we know, then exploded. So the idea next is that for these new small modular reactors, they'll be smaller, faster, lighter, denser, cheaper. There's the title of my 5th book. Than they are now, right? That they can use molten salt or other things. Then that you can, if there is a problem, that they simply shut down, and there is no need to worry about them overheating and having any kind of catastrophic failure.
So there was the only ability to cool down the Fukushima plant was if it had active power. And you're talking about a system that if everything was shut down, it would just shut down on its own. And you wouldn't lose this cooling system that was needed to keep it from melting down, essentially.
Right. Well, and this is one of the key things. Remember, Chris, we're going to bring this back to the present. Is an issue at Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which has now been claimed by the Russian government for its own. It's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. I think it's 6 gigawatts. It's a very large plant. And it's been shelled many times. They've had the power supply shut off. They've had to fire up the on-site generators to make sure that they have on-site power. The system, the plant is in safe shutdown mode now. But you need power at these plants. You need lights. You need the workers. They have to be, they got to, you have to. One of the things about power plants is you can't turn the power off the power plant. So, these are things around the design that have to be paid attention to. They need attention. And this new breed of reactors is very promising. I think what to me is the really interesting part of where we are now is which company and which countries are going to be the ones that prevail. I tend to think Rolls-Royce is going to have an inside track, particularly in Britain. Now, would I bet on them? No, but here's an old line industrial company, has very close ties to the British government. Britain is perhaps more screwed than any other country in Europe. And so there's a lot of motivation in Britain to get new nuclear built and do it quickly, besides Hinkley Point C, which is the big reactor project that's owned by the Electricité de France. And I don't know if the Chinese are still involved in that or whatever, but but that's a mega plant, right? They're also looking at Rolls-Royce to say, let's build some SMRs. And I think their project is 300 megawatts, 400 megawatts, not exactly small, 300 or 400 megawatts electric, but still perhaps could be built and deployed more quickly than one of these large reactors.
The Rolls-Royce is not just a car company.
Okay, now remember, the Rolls-Royce, the car company, is now owned by BMW. We're talking about Rolls-Royce, the jet engine maker, and the other it's a big industrial company, right? So they split, right? There are two companies. Well, I guess there are three now. So there's Rolls-Royce PLC. I think there's Rolls-Royce, the auto company, which is part of BMW, and there is Rolls-Royce SMR. They call Rolls-Royce SMR a separate company, but I think it's still owned by Rolls-Royce, the industrial company. But it gets complicated. But I need to refresh my own memory about this.
I have no memory to refresh to speak of. This is not something I ever knew.
Right. So that's Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. Is the Rolls-Royce motorcars.com. And then you have Rolls-Royce, which is the company that does aerospace defense, power systems. So different company, Rolls-Royce PLC, right? Rolls-Royce PLC is definitely, I wrote a piece about this in Forbes not too long ago that, yes, in fact, that is the case. They are moving full bore straight ahead on deploying an SMR, and they have things that are out to bid, and so yes, this is going forward very definitely.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman. Just want to take a quick break to tell you all I appreciate you so much for listening to the show, and it's still a new show, still a growing show, and if you want to help me out, I would greatly appreciate it. Simplest thing you could do is recommend it to a friend and give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Their algorithms rank the shows higher, make it more visible, make it more searchable if it has more star ratings, more reviews. So anything like that would be very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Back to the show. Can you say some more about nuclear safety for people who have maybe the wrong idea about how safe, how dangerous, what the risks are, specifically with regard to radiation and nuclear waste? What you said, the fears of radiation are overblown. What are the genuine risks?
The genuine risks are if you have exposure to very high levels of radiation for a long time, you can suffer serious health consequences. But this is the problem. Here it is. Yes, BMW Group owns Rolls-Royce. I think they were taken over in 1998. This has been done. This is a long time ago now. They're still produced in Britain, but owned by the Germans.
We figured it out.
But as far as radiation, one of the best movies, the best things I've ever seen that explains radiation and the overblown fears of it is Robert Stone's book, Pandora's Promise. And he goes to Fukushima and he goes to Chernobyl and he takes a dosimeter and he stands in front in all of these locations. He goes and stands in front of the camera with the dosimeter. I don't think it's a Geiger counter, but he shows that the number of millisieverts in each location. And then he goes to a beach in Brazil and shows that the level of radiation there, it was higher than what he saw in Chernobyl and Fukushima. So, we have to, the key on understanding radiation is compared to what? How much radiation are we getting and how much is dangerous? That's the key. As I said before, radiation, you don't feel it, you don't smell it, you don't touch it, taste it. it's hard to know, right? You don't know how much you're getting. So people just have a natural fear of it because it's the bogeyman. So is this going to be easy to change people's minds, Chris? No, I don't think it's not going to be easy. But you know what we it is imperative that we change our, and I'm using the broad our here, but what is broad is critically important that we educate the general public and change the culture around this, because we have to put that radiation risk into perspective. Otherwise, we have no hope of making significant progress on decarbonization.
Now, what about nuclear waste?
Not a problem.
Go on.
It is a political problem, not a scientific problem. No one has ever been killed by or harmed by nuclear waste. I've stood next to these big, dry casks at Indian Point. They're these massive structures, massive big spools of concrete and steel. You can't walk away with one of these. You have to have a massive, this like a tank to even move the damn things. But yet then again, this has been one of the very effective tropes that the anti-nuclear NGOs have used to prevent the use of nuclear energy. Oh, we don't have a solution for the waste. The problem is we don't have the political will to deal with the waste. The French manage their nuclear waste just fine. So do the Japanese. If they can do it, we can do it. But we don't have the political will. And one of the reasons why Obama got elected was when he was running, he went to Harry Reid. Harry Reid said, "I'll back you, but you have to abandon Yucca Mountain." Obama said, "Deal." So Obama gets in office. What does he do? What the first thing? Kills Yucca Mountain. So we don't have a federal repository for the waste, so we have this kind of stasis now, this kind of stupid gridlock in Washington for more than 40 years, despite the federal government saying we'll take under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1980 something or other, we'll take all that waste, we'll manage it. They haven't, and so we're kind of stuck on this. But it's we're stuck because of a lack of political courage. A lack of political will in Washington. It's something nobody wants to talk about. We'll punt that until next time because it's kind of a hard problem to solve, and so it doesn't get solved.
How is it being managed currently?
The spent fuel is being stored on site at these nuclear plants.
And it's just in gigantic concrete drums, essentially.
That's right. Yeah, dry cask storage is the term of art.
And is that a safety concern?
No. It's
not for being stolen, but I know that it's not,
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know how much dynamite you would need to go over next to one of these and try and blow one up. And I don't even think you could you could harm it if you did that. I mean, because it's so heavy and the radiation levels fall very quickly. So, it is one of these other obstacles. Oh, we can't solve the waste problem, therefore we can't build any more reactors. Well, that is convenient if you only want to build renewables. But if we want to be serious about moving forward and increasing electricity supplies, decreasing emissions, there's only one way to do it at scale, and that's with nuclear power. And so I'm kind of an absolutist on this. I'm definitely end to end natural gas. That is the way to get us to the nuclear future. And there's a lot of gas in the world, and we're going to be using a lot of gas for a very long time. We're also going to be using a lot of coal and a lot of oil. But I think I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, and I can say I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, and you don't have to be pro-nuclear and care about climate change. You can just say, yeah, I mean, we need nuclear regardless of what you think about climate change.
That's always struck me as an odd thing, that there is this disconnect between people who ostensibly care a lot about climate change and carbon in the atmosphere and are anti-nuclear explicitly or implicitly, just by disposition. Sometimes it seems like not through any explicit beliefs. Yeah, it just feels like the anti-natural thing.
Yeah, it is. And my take on that is very clear. If you're anti-nuclear and anti-carbon dioxide, you're pro-blackout. Well, I'm anti-blackout. I'm adamantly anti-blackout. I got blacked out 2 years ago in this here in Austin. And we need an overhaul on our thinking about nuclear. But there are many impediments, and these anti-nuclear NGOs are one of the biggest ones. That's one of the reasons why I wrote this piece, The Anti-Industry Industry, on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. Sign up.
Find it on the show notes. And what about concerns about how long nuclear waste lasts?
Again, the levels of radiation fall very quickly on these used nuclear fuel rods. And also remember that this used fuel can be recycled. That
was my next question.
And this is one reason why I'm excited to go to Japan is the Japanese are doing that. They're reprocessing their waste, their used fuel, and putting into new into new fuel systems, new rods. It's called MOX. This is doable, but you have to have the political will to do it. And this is something the U.S. now, because we are very partisan and very split politically, that is very hard to do.
And then further, the amount, I've heard you mention this, I've heard Michael Schellenberger, Alex Epstein bring up, the total amount of nuclear waste is not as much as people might think, and it pales in comparison to the amount of waste produced by other forms of energy. You could fit all the nuclear waste ever created on a football field stacked, 10 meters high? What's the figure?
Something like that. One soccer pitch, 3 or 4 meters high, something like that. This is not a huge amount of stuff. And yet we've been conditioned to fear it and to, think that this is a big problem. Well, no. And Schellenberger makes a really good point that he said nuclear energy is the only form of power generation that contains its own waste. And it is just, once he said it, I thought it's really pretty profound, right? When you burn coal or oil or natural gas, of course, you send CO2 into the atmosphere. If you have solar or wind, okay, you're not producing any waste right when you're producing power, but when they wear out, you got to take that stuff and put it somewhere else, right? You got to put it in the landfill and then build another thing. Nuclear reactors can last for 100 years. You can, they last generations. And so, and the waste fuel that they produce, it's right there. You don't know, it doesn't have to go somewhere else. It's right on the same spot where you used it in the first place. And then if you're serious and want to, wring more energy out of it, you can reprocess it and do it again. So, but this requires significant political will. And I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to say this is not important. It is. It's incredibly important. But we have to be realistic about this. We need sobriety when we think about these issues. And we're just kind of at the moment, and I'll say this about the Biden administration, they're drunk. I mean, when it comes to energy policy and understanding how serious and how seriously we need to be taking our energy and power systems, they are not sober at all. They're drinking this Kool-Aid on the renewables and we're going to cover the world with renewable energy and we're going to double the size of the grid. The hell you are. It's not going to happen. And yet we don't have any, I'll put it this way. Energy realism is energy humanism, Chris. We need energy realism because energy realism is energy humanism. We need that. And we need a lot of it. And we have very little of it in Washington.
Can you contextualize the claims that people make sometimes that solar and wind are actually cheaper forms of energy than fossil fuels and other things? I hear this sometimes, and I hear people like you and other people in, I don't know what you call the energy humanist movement, say this is nonsense. Can you make this make sense to me? Like, are people just lying? Are they being optimistic? What's going on here?
Well, cost is not the same as value. This is one of the things that you have to understand. Well, levelized cost of energy. Okay, so they're taking a snapshot in time of saying at this point, the amount of the watt hour produced by this solar panel or this wind turbine is the cheapest on the dispatch curve. Okay, that's fine. But what about when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining? Oh, okay. Here's one of the best examples. And I thought about this in terms of taxis, but a guy that I have had on my podcast, Brett Randall, we haven't aired the episode yet, but he calls it random Uber. Okay. So, and this goes to the heart of the understanding or misunderstanding about electricity. Electricity is a service. It's not a commodity. It's a service and you can't let it fail, right? We think about it as a commodity. Oh, it's a watt hour. Well, I need watts. Watt hours. I don't really think about. So, start there. Electricity is a service. Uber is a service. Okay. So if I need to go downtown and I need to be there in 20 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to call up an Uber and they're going to be here in 5 and it's going to take me 5 to get downtown. The service worked for me. But imagine that when you call the Uber that they say, well, we can't take you now. Because our Uber is down, none of our drivers are available. We can take you in 3 hours. Well, I can't go in 3 hours. My meeting is in 20 minutes. I need to go now. So in addition to that Uber, that random Uber, you need a reliable Uber who can take you in the next 20 minutes. So not with random Uber, solar and wind or random Uber, that you have to have 2 Ubers. You have to have one that's reliable, that it's a Toyota Camry. And when you start up, it's going to take you downtown. But you got this other one you have to pay for too. So I think that putting it in terms of a service that you has to be reliable puts it in context. So, oh well, the random Uber is cheaper. Well, it's cheaper if it's available, but if it's not, then it's a lot more expensive.
Maybe one way of putting that, it's like you have the random Uber, but you also have to own your own car just on standby.
Yeah.
It's like having the fossil fuel backup constantly for when the wind's not blowing.
Well,
when
that's
the
another
sun's
way
not
to
shining.
think about it, right? Because my wife and I, well, frankly, our cars are old. We have 3 of them. We have a truck, we have a sedan, and we have a 4Runner. Well, a few weeks ago, only one of them was working. One was in the shop. The battery went bad on the other one. So, but I'm just saying that because it popped in my head. But right, so the random Uber, oh well, it can't take me. Well, then I have to drive myself. Okay, well, I'm going to drive myself downtown. But it cost me $30 to park downtown. I mean, it's in Austin, right? The downtown parking is scarce. It's expensive. I might be able to find a place on the street, but if I have to park in a garage, it's going to cost me a lot more than if I'd just taken that Uber and it cost me $10, right? Instead, I'm going to have to pay to drive myself, and I'm going to have to pay for parking, and it's going to cost more than if I'd just taken the Uber in the first place.
So the disconnect here is calculating the cost of solar power, for instance, only in an isolated circumstance in the best of circumstances. And what you should really be doing is comparing the overall cost and value of one system versus another system.
I think that's a fair way to put it. Yeah. But you have to calculate in the cost of the dispatchable generation that has to be there in addition to the solar and wind. I mean, this is causing all the conniptions here in Texas because we have this energy only market. And so the generators are able to, some of them are making money, some of them aren't. I mean, it's a very difficult system to administer. But this is part of the broader challenge and the broader issues on the electric grid and how we have to think about it for the future. And I think the key is to think about it as a service. And we need active government and responsible government to make sure that the system is affordable, reliable, and resilient. And right now, we don't have that because no one is responsible.
This is not something that I've ever followed much at all, but do you have any thoughts or hopes about fusion power?
Well, sure. I mean, it sounds cool, and it could be cool, but I'm 62 years old this year. I'm going to turn 63 in July. I've heard about fusion since I was a kid. It was always 20 years away. 20 years away, 30 years away. I think fusion is, okay. Well, it's awesome. That's great if it works, but there are a lot of technical challenges around the amount of the flux, the radiation, the temperature. How are you going to manage this? What they announced is important, a few weeks ago where they said, well, we had a sustained reaction for, 6 milliseconds. Okay, fine. Fission works. Let's focus on fission. Let's make that work. Let's scale that up. And now I'm not saying let's not invest in fusion. There's a lot of investment happening in fusion, but the hype around that announcement a few weeks ago, I thought was just ridiculous. I mean, come on, sober up here, folks.
And, the lag time between a workable prototype and actual, penetration in the market and affecting ordinary people could be decades as well. And we're not even at like a practical prototype. So that's kind of what I thought you'd say. Are you working on any upcoming projects at the moment you want to plug? You mentioned a documentary.
Well, of course, I'm doing the Power Hungry podcast every week. I'm on TikTok now. I'm doing TikTok videos. I'm doing putting them on Twitter. I'm on Twitter, PWR Hungry, Power Hungry on Twitter. I'm working on a new documentary called Burning Down the Grid with my colleague Tyson Culver. We're hoping to have that finished by the middle of the year. I'm on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. I'm having fun, Chris. I'm producing a ton of content. I'm working not all the time. I'm working a lot, but as I said at the beginning, I'm a very lucky man. I've got a beautiful family, a beautiful wife, and passionate about these energy and power issues. And I hope that I can contribute positively in the discussion to increase literacy and numeracy in energy and power, because these are the challenges that we face.
Do you have any recommendations for a book or an author that would complement your work especially well?
Well, sure. Well, buy my books first. You don't have to read them. You just have to buy them.
Buy all of Robert's books first.
Buy them on your Kindle and make a better royalty. I'm a big fan of Václav Smil. He's not the most graceful writer, but he's incredibly prolific and has written a number of books that have had a great influence on me. His book, Inventing the 20th Century, is one of my favorites. That book I think is a marvel. He has a new book out that's gotten a lot of good press called How the World Really Works, I think. So Václav Smil is really quite good. I really like the work of Jesse Ausubel. He's been a big influence on me. Ausubel, Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University. His essay, Nuclear Heresies, changed the course of my career. And he's been nothing but gracious to me. And so I'm a big, I'm very fortunate to count Jesse as a friend and a mentor. And so yeah, Smil and Ausubel, I think they hung the moon. So how about those two?
Beautiful. My guest today has been Robert Bryce. Please check him out over at the Power Hungry podcast. And his book, once again, is A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. Robert, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Awesome to be with you, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.